This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I am your host, Mike Rapin. With me this week, two fantastic human beings. I'm joined by Paul Jasley.
Hello.
And Travis Smith.
Hey, Mike.
Thank you so much for joining me. Travis, you are a special guest on this episode today because you are the author of Superhero Ethics, 10 comic book heroes, 10 ways to save the world. Which one do we need most now? Travis, could you tell us a little bit about yourself before we go into talking about your book and all the comics that you've been reading and everything else?
Sure thing, Mike. So I'm a professor of political theory at Concordia University, which is in the heart of downtown Montreal. I published Superhero Ethics in 2018 as an attempt to try to combine my interest in popular culture, comic books specifically, and my trade, as it were, in political philosophy. And so that's me. By day, teaching Plato and Aristotle in the classroom, and by night, not fighting crime, rather, but reading about fighting crime.
Planning to fight crime one day. I get it. Well, that's fantastic. I mean, thank you so much for coming on the show. We're really excited to chat with you. But I got to know, we ask on most of the episodes, how have you been? How have comic books been? So I'm curious to know, how have you been? And what kind of comic books have you been reading?
Well, it's COVID times, and COVID times are strange. I'm currently full-time trying to figure out how to teach my classes remotely on the internet. My university is one of those. It's decided to spend the upcoming term online only, except for, chemists who have to be in the lab or something.
Right.
Dancers who have to perform physically in front of people. But the rest of us are teaching remotely. So I'm trying to get up to speed. I'm not that technologically savvy myself. I realized I've turned into my dad. I remember when I was my son's age, at least once a week, my father would have to walk in the room and say, "Do you know how to record something on the VCR?" And I fear I've become the 2020 equivalent of that technologically. So I hope I'm coming through clearly on the podcast right now. I needed my son's help to hook me up with a headset. And COVID times are weird, and so I've streamed too much media. Doing a lot of reading as well, and trying to get some exercise, and that's been March, April, May, June, July, August, all bleeding into each other. So that's me. That's me now. What was the other thing you asked me, Mike?
What kind of comics have you been reading? I mean, you said you've been doing a lot of reading, so I'm curious. I know we talked a little bit before the show over email of some of the things, but I wanted to discuss them further with you here on the show.
Actually, this morning I read issues 1 and 2 of The Seeds from Dark Horse.
Okay.
I had been waiting for 3 and 4 to come out, and then I saw on the last issue of the Diamond Previews that they're going to not publish 3 and 4 and go straight to the trade. And I had been on my copies of 1 and 2 because miniseries like this, I usually wait till I have all the issues and then read the whole thing in a sitting rather than one issue every month. I find that if I just read the one issue a month now, I have a hard time remembering what happened last month, and I'd much more prefer to sit and read the series all at once. And so I went ahead and read 1 and 2 now to decide whether or not I wanted to put my money into the trade and pay twice for issues 1 and 2, as it were. And I've decided that, yes, I will. That's fantastic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm right there with you. I mean, I'm always, I was very skeptical when I heard that David Alha was doing a book and that he was going to put out a monthly book, even as a 4-issue miniseries. Yeah. I was like, sure you will, David. I just want to root for you. And then, of course, there's like 6, 7, 8, 9 months of delay when it comes to it. It's like, yeah, this is to be expected. It's Hawkeye all over again. And Travis, I don't know if you read the Hawkeye series that he did with. Yeah. So, I mean, it's kind of expected, but I'm glad that we're at least getting the collected edition. I'm very excited for that.
Yeah, I mean, there are other books we're waiting for longer. I'm waiting for, Black Monday Murders, and we'll get those someday. Hickman came through with Shield Volume 2, 5, and 6 eventually, so...
Right, yeah.
Those Hickman books are just absolutely cursed, I think. I don't know what it is. We get 6, 7, 8 issues in, and then suddenly they just disappear. Or in the case of The Dead and the Dying, I think they got 2 or 3 issues in, and then it just fell off the radar.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, and then that we got teased with the Frontier, and then who knows if I ever see that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, with these creators, they're so, I mean, especially I think it's a lot of the times it's the artists, just their art is incredibly immaculate and it's so inspiring, and then it's like it's the biggest letdown when their books just don't come out. And you can't really fault them because you understand like it is tough to create these things, and we should applaud them for every issue that comes out, but yet I still find myself sitting at home just like, when is this freaking comic book coming out? I get very internet angry.
Well, I got very excited in the last previews because they're doing a Madam Satan one shot from Archie and the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina universe. And
nice.
That's a book where it was my top of the pile every month when it came out for the however many issues it did, 8 I think, 5 or 6, and then later 2 more, and then. I guess if it's a pitch for a Netflix series that makes that much more money, then fine. But it was, that was a tremendous series. So I'm glad to see that they're returning now that the TV show's been canceled. They're returning to its roots in Archie Comics. That's something to look forward to.
Yeah.
Sure. And then let me see what else. I've got my sort of recent read box. So I grabbed a bunch of things out of there since I know you and I said we'd talk about this. So I think the last issue of the second volume of Dark Arc from Aftershock came out. Really enjoying that book. Star Trek Year 5 from IDW. I really like they've got the voices of the characters just right. I mean, when you're writing or reading a licensed product, so much of it is whether or not you can hear the dialogue in the voice of the character from the screen or not, right? Does it sound like them?
Right.
And then I think that they've got the voices just right in this series, and so I'm enjoying that one.
So I'm actually not too familiar with that series. Is this based off of the original like Star Trek cast, or is it something else?
Yeah, no, it's Kirk and crew. They did a Year 4 couple of series recently as well, which I've not read. I jumped on with Year 5, and so it's the idea that this is their mission before they came back to finish their 5-year original mission. And they've got some of the characters from the animated series on the crew because that supposedly took place in Year 4, right, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
And they meet up with the Tholians again, and they rescue a Tholian from a Civil War situation, and Gary Seven returns. It's good.
Okay. I mean, I've never been someone that's gotten really into Star Trek, but I mean, comics are always the way to get me into pretty much any fandom. So maybe this is how I start my journey into the great beyond that is Star Trek.
The comics are really hit or miss, but when they get it right, the John Byrne Picto comics, the Fumettis were actually really good too.
That's the series where they like cropped pieces of the TV show and kind of put them in pages with different dialogue.
Very well crafted. I got a real kick out of every issue of that series.
Interesting.
I mean, he was able to get the exact right body language and facial expressions taken from actual footage and place them to tell a new story, and it's really well done. Yeah, my son, I have a 13-year-old son, and he and I worked our way through all 3 seasons of the original series in the past several months, largely during COVID, and so trying to raise my son right.
Starting with the old stuff, and then eventually he can graduate into Deep Space Nine and Next Generation, all that stuff, right?
Deep Space Nine is the one that I'm looking forward to most. It's my favorite. I'm in the minority position there, but as a political theorist, I think it's probably just because it's the one with the best, most interesting political theory stuff going on in it. Other shows have maybe more anthropology or moral philosophy, and Deep Space Nine's a lot of political theory. So I take to it just for professional reasons.
Right, of course. It's research. Yeah.
Right. Well, I keep intending to write a paper on Odo versus Quark on the best regime in theory and the best regime in practice, but I haven't actually sat down to write it yet. The title in my mind is good enough for me.
Right.
All of us academics have 100 imagined articles that we would have written if only we had, had the time or the resolve to do so.
Yes, I understand.
Jeff Lemire and Dustin Nguyen's Zander. The art in that's just so pretty.
I've always been someone that was so baffled by the idea of Nguyen going from something like Lil Gotham to doing Descender, right? And then seeing his art on the page, like with Descender and then now Ascender, floors me. It just floors me at how wonderful he is able to make like the outer reaches of space so bright and yet so grim at the same time because his art is so bright in a lot of ways. I've loved that book from the beginning. It's fantastic. Absolutely. I'm glad to hear you're liking it too.
Absolutely. I emailed you last night with my grief that to switch to DC Comics, my grief that Young Justice is being canceled.
Right.
I've just been the recovering. There's a real sort of '90s feel I feel to it. It's got the Bendis voice, right? But
the
Bendis banter. But we're all used to that, and if whether you like it or don't like it, you can at least forgive it because you know what its purpose is, and the introduction of the lost characters combined with the introduction of several new characters that are in some ways familiar, like new legacy characters, which is totally in the spirit of the original Young Justice to have new legacy characters. It would have been anti-Young Justice if it had only used the old legacy characters. So having to introduce new ones as well is consistent with the idea of the book, the concept of the book. I've been enjoying that. Far Sector.
Yes.
Jamal Campbell's art is just it makes the book. I'm still on a wait and see with the story. I'm constantly giving it the benefit of the doubt. I like the new character. I'm not sure I like the world and the premise of the story as much as I like the character, and I love the art.
Okay. I mean, Paul introduced that book to me on like a random Twitter thread that I was just like, somebody give me some Big Two books. I don't know what's going on. Because I read a lot of independent stuff. I haven't really kept up with a lot of the Big Two stuff outside of the X-Men, and so Paul recommended Far Sector, and I devoured like the first 7 issues or whatever 6 issues that were out
it is one that I am reading month to month, and maybe if I went back and read the whole thing all at once, like I was saying, I tend to with independent series. Maybe that would be the better way to read it. It's a dense book.
Yeah, I had that issue too because I read the first issue and then kind of let 3 or 4 issues pile up and then read that as a chunk. And I think I enjoyed that a lot more. It is such a densely woven story, and there's a lot of political intrigue and, racial tension in the story. It kind of helps to read it all in one go, I think. So that might be the way to do it.
Yeah, I think I should revisit it because it's just so nice to look at. I won't regret it even if just to check the art out again. I've got Avengers Fantastic Four Empire #4, Carol Danvers variant cover in front of me. I'm a bit of a mark for Carol Danvers, and so I tend to pick up variants wherever Carol appears.
Oh, okay.
I don't want to be negative about much, but remember when, these kinds of Kree-Skrull crossovers would take place, in 2 giant-sized annuals in the summer of like 1985? You'd get Fantastic Four Annual and Part 1 and Avengers Annual Part 2, and that would be like the whole story.
Mm-hmm. Is that how they used to do crossovers? I can't remember.
I know. Empire, I think, would have been great as a 2 giant-sized issue story and not as 36 issues or planned 48. It suffers from the dragged out crossover.
Okay,
even if they're rushing it almost on a weekly basis post COVID. I mean, it's not objectionable. It's just it doesn't seem to. I mean, it's not like the Infinity Wars one that also ran too many issues.
Right.
Yeah, I think that was the one where Hickman ran like through New Avengers.
No, I think it was after that.
Oh, okay.
One after that.
Oh, that's the one after that. Okay, yeah. I think Infinity was the last major event that I bought all in for, and after that, I was so burned out. I just said, unless it's X-Men, don't count me in.
Well, I'm looking at my X books right now, and my 3 favorites from the last month were Hellions #2. I'm getting that. Wolverine #3, which I enjoyed as well. I can never see Quentin Quire die enough times. The more times, the better. And X Factor #1, which I just totally loved. As a Canadian growing up in the 80s, we were all legally obliged to love Alpha Flight.
Right. Understandable.
And so North Star and Aurora are among the characters that are dear to my heart.
I see.
And North Star is one of the best lovable jerks in the Marvel Universe.
Absolutely.
And it's just such a fantastic job of assembling. And I mean, again, it's in the spirit of X Factor that some of these characters have X Factor, cred, like Polaris, and Others are new to X Factor, but they're thrown together to serve the purposes of the investigations sort of storyline. So I thought that was great. And I think it really fits in with the Hickman X verse to have a team like this. It's like, all these sort of teams are coordinated to sort of hit all the archetypes of all the X books, right? And so, every kind of X book has its corner of the Hickman verse here, the X verse that they've got going on now. And even when they're bright, there's something very dark going on under the surface in all of these books. And, I like his Avengers run. It's going to run some 100-something issues before we find out how dark it really is. But
hopefully, if Marvel lets him do it. But sorry, go ahead, Paul.
That might be my question for you. I am a very, very casual X-Men fan. I've not read very much, but I did read House of X, Powers of 10. And I'm curious, maybe that was a book that really did seem, at least in my reading, to explore some political theory issues. What was your response to that book? Did you find it as engaging as maybe you had hoped?
My memory is not going to be good at distinguishing what happened in Powers of 10 and House of at the same time.
Sure.
Right.
I mean, it's one big story. It should have just been one big book, if we're being honest here, folks.
Yeah. Well, that's what I see, that there's this Swords of X miniseries coming out, and I was thinking, isn't already every X book the largest crossover, event comic ever right now already? I mean, now they're going to have like a mini within the mega. I mean, there's a lot of interesting and relevant politics stuff going on in all the X books. The decision to embrace tribalism in an extreme form. We've seen it before in the past, but even I think this is the most extreme version of it. All the technological issues with resurrection is also. We're thinking about the what's what I want, allowing the villains to have a place, and the ethics of forgiveness. Or there's a sort of giving up on humanity and the attempts to forge lasting, peaceful, and integrated relationships with Homo sapiens and an embrace of Homo superior as a nation and tribe of its own apart. At the same time, you've got an ethic of forgiveness in which all the villains, so having Sinister and Apocalypse around the same table and so forth, and being treated as if they're all in it together. Is a fascinating sort of flip sides of each other. Those two things. We'll see where it goes.
Yeah,
yeah. The thing that continues to shock me is how well everyone seems to be getting along for the most part, right? I mean, I know we've had books, and this is just me just going on my X-Men soapbox here, but like we've had books where clearly some of the more villainous characters are kind of doing villainy things, but at the end of the day, they all kind of play within the same like playground. They're not trying to break out or do anything that would go against like this overall umbrella rule that everyone has seemed to accept as being the way to move forward, especially with the spoilers revelation at the end of House of X and Powers of 10 that all of this is ultimately going to fail. Right? Like I like that. I mean, and no one knows that except for Moira and Professor X, and I think Magneto. And I think those are the only people that really know what the long-term, scenario looks like. But until then, it's like we're trying to literally make the best of the world that we possibly can. And the only way to do that is to separate ourselves and make sure that we pull everyone into the fold. And that means everyone, because we have to stick together no matter who we are. And it's like you said, it's creating this tribalism. But the fact that the stories, we haven't seen any stories yet that feature anybody really trying to break from that mold is pretty interesting. I know that there are people that have resisted coming to the island of Krakoa, and there are people that have decided that they don't like it, but they have to stay. Or if you're in Kitty Pryde situation where you don't know whether you're accepted or you're not because of this whole issue with the Krakoan gates, we've seen some of that, but I think on the whole, we haven't seen any true dissonance, and I'm sure that's coming in the next year or two, because eventually we need to have that story in this epic or epoch of the X-Men timeline, I guess, because this is just how it's going to be for a little bit, and then we're going to move past it, I guess. But I just find it really interesting to see like how well it's all stuck together and how well it works. Given that I feel like it goes against the entire idea of the X-Men, and yet it feels like the natural progression for them. If they said, we're done trying to make this work, going off on our own, and we have to exist on this planet, so we're going to create our own area of land because nothing that's out there is available to us safely. I find that to be extremely interesting. And I'm not a political theorist. I'm just some guy who reads comic books and builds web pages for a living. But I find like the dilemma to be really, really interesting.
Yeah, we already had Deadpool, an crossover issue of his book called them fascists, something like 12 times in one issue.
Oh, good.
Okay.
I haven't read that one.
Yeah, it was 6, I think it was. Reed Richards, of course, the crossover with the FF, the scene at the end. Did you see that one? You're saying we're going to air this in a while, so spoiler alert, but it's been out for a few months. But
I haven't read the end of it, but you can go ahead and spoil it because I wasn't really reading that book too closely.
Yeah, so Professor X wipes from Reed's mind the knowledge of how to undo their undo everything, and he leaves in Reed's mind knowledge that it has been erased, which he says is different than how we used to do things in the Illuminati. In the Illuminati, we just erased things and people didn't know it had been erased. But I want you, Reed Richards, to know that I've done this to you. So every time you try to think of how to solve this again, you won't be able to, and you'll know it's my fault that you can't. So there's a real sort of that, we don't know how dark this Professor X is going to get. We already know that Hickman's Illuminati Professor X is already dark. I mean, there's that great scene where he, in one of the early meetings of the Illuminati where Professor X makes says, well, I would never read anybody's minds without their permission. And like Tony Stark and Reed Richards are like, come on, who are you trying to fool? Namor's like just scoffing.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's what made that book so funny, is like to see all of these powers come together and they're all are calling each other on their bullshit. Like I found that to be fantastic. I love that book to death. But yeah, I guess was there any other comics you wanted to jump into?
I was just going to say that perspective you had on we know how it's going to turn out, but we're trying to muddle through the best we can. I just in the last few days, I finally got through the HBO Watchmen series, and it has a sort of similar feel to the end of that there as well, right? Even throughout the entire thing. So that perspective is present in that TV series as well. But this is a comic books podcast.
Yeah. I mean, in regards to that TV show, I mean, we have yet to have, I think, a deep conversation about that on the show. I honestly want to like dedicate almost like a whole minisode where we back to back, like read the comic, watch the TV show, which is a huge endeavor for anyone involved, which is why it would probably be a special episode. That's probably just me and Nick and Paul, the only people I could probably convince to do that, and where we talk about it. But I really, really enjoyed that TV show. Paul, did you get a chance to watch that?
Not yet, but I will make time.
Okay, then all right, then I won't go into any of the details because I think that it's a fascinating look and approach to finding an actual sequel to the original Watchmen story, and keeping a lot of the themes and ideas in place without relying too much on the comic itself. Like it's such an interesting take, and I say this because I listened to like the officially sanctioned HBO podcast that they did, which was actually really interesting because I think Damon Lindelof is very blunt and honest about his work, which it was really interesting to hear the showrunner talk so raw about this TV series.
I haven't heard that. I'm usually of the opinion that real artists should never tell you honestly anything about what they really mean or intended, and when they do, you should assume that they're lying. If they're a real artist, I mean, like the creator of why can't I think of his name, of Breaking Bad?
His name is escaping my head, but all I can I know who you're talking about. Yes, Vince. Oh man, now you're killing me with this.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Apologies, everybody. Everyone listening is yelling at us.
Vince Gilligan, that's his name.
Okay. Yeah, he would go and give interviews about what the show means, and they were all lies. It was great listening to him just constantly, making it. And again, we go back and listen to Paul McCartney and John Lennon talk about what their songs are about. They're always lying.
Sure.
And so, I'm always disappointed when artists, actually tell you what they really meant.
Well, I would say that I don't think that the podcast series was about explaining the show. I think it was more about like explaining why they made I guess maybe it kind of explains it, but it's like why they made the choices they did, how they tried to intertwine the themes of the show with the comic, while trying to like show actual homage to the original work. And it's unfortunate because I think like maybe if Alan Moore consumed anything regarding Watchmen, he might actually enjoy this TV show. But then again, he probably also thinks Watchmen should have only existed as its own thing.
Yeah.
And I know that's a whole other debate we could get into. But yeah, I mean, I thought it was a really good show. Paul, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it when you get a chance to see it. Obviously, no pressure.
Aesthetically, it's very well put together, and the characters and the depictions are consistent, I think, with the source material. If anybody watched the conclusion of the series and thought that was a happy ending, they clearly don't understand Watchmen.
Yes, that is absolutely true. But I guess we also came here today to talk about. I mean, I'd love to continue talking comic books about you, but we want to talk about a little bit about Superhero Ethics, the book that you put out in 2018. I guess my first question is, like, you said you wanted to try to meld like your two lives and interests into one thing. Did you originally sit down to say like, I'm going to write a book about superheroes, or was there more thought of it than just that simple idea that came out of my brain?
Actually, it had it had a more humbler origins. I had seen an article in a magazine praising the Batman, especially the Batman as depicted in the Nolan trilogy, and tried to claim that Batman was the hero that we needed today. That Batman was the hero that we needed today. Okay. And I wrote a sort of article back, talking about why we ought to prefer Spider-Man, why we ought to prefer Peter Parker to Bruce Wayne as the hero that we need today. And so I wrote a sort of this Spider-Man versus Batman from a sort of ethical, political perspective. It led to a series of chapters of this versus kind, where I picked two heroes that have something in common but still represent something different, and ask, which of these is the one that, represents from the perspective of classical ethics, the kind of character, the kind of personality, the kind of attitude toward the world, the kind of action we might take to make our relationships with each other better, which is the one that, under our current circumstances, we might praise more or wish we could emulate better than we do. And so that was the origin of it. It was the original, of course, the original article had a sort of, and that's all I have to say on the matter kind of conclusion.
Right.
Right. Enough said. You got the classic Stan sign off. I get you.
Yeah, I should have listened to, Dr. Manhattan telling me that nothing ever ends.
Because then a book. Yes, I got you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was really fortunate to get a chance to write a book. It took a while. It took several rewrites. I usually write strictly academic stuff, and I don't think one should write about comic books and superhero movies in a strictly academic voice. There's just kind of a dissonance if you do that. I mean, people do it, and there's great scholarship out there on it. It's not what I wanted to do for a book that I had intended for a broader audience. I was trying to write a book for a broader audience and not just comic scholars. I mean, comic scholarship is a great interdisciplinary field as well, and I love attending those conferences as a professional political theorist, but as someone who wanted to mainly talk about comic books to an audience of people who love the movies. My main target were not necessarily us hardcore comic book fans only. I actually needed to avoid that as well. I needed to write something that would be accessible and familiar to people who mainly just know the characters from the movies. So my wife, who has never read a single comic book and to this day continues to insist she wouldn't know which order to read the bubbles in, would still have to proofread and understand every chapter because she's sat through all of the movies with me. I would say forced to, except for that would be a lie because she's always happy to watch Robert Downey Jr.
Right.
Well, that's what I thought was interesting about the book, because I think, my interest in superheroes always has been the idea of them being sort of paragons or examples that we can look to as, the type of people we should be as ethical examples. But you've taken that idea and kind of put it into the common comic book nerd discussion of who would win in a fight. So you're kind of bridging both of those gaps,
Yeah, I mean, there's a deliberate, the framing mechanism of the book to give it that sort of that versus that quality was certainly a deliberate sort of nod to the way in which we as comic book readers are used to gathering around the stores on Wednesdays in non-COVID times and having these kinds of arguments over who's better, whether it's which character or which artist or creator, right? So I wanted to sort of appeal to that familiar part of what makes being a comic book reader fun, that we have these kinds of arguments.
Yeah, and I mean, it was interesting, the way that you paired things up. I was curious, just going through the chapters really quick. There's and again, everyone should go out and read and buy this book. It's a fun read. It's a really interesting look at characters that I think, like, I know a lot of, and it was interesting to see them pitted up against each other, and compared in a way that wasn't just a Capcom, video game where you just mash the buttons together until you beat your opponent.
Right.
But actually to hear them like discussed back and forth. I mean, we have things like the best of the beastly, beacons of imagination, responsibility in the city, ideals in action, gods in a long box. And I was curious to know, were there other chapters that were potentially considered for this book? Because, I think you cover like a good swath of things, but as someone that doesn't, read a lot of, ethical theory or, political theory and everything like that, were there other like pillars of that type of discussion that you considered for the book?
Right. Yeah. When I set the table of contents, you can sort of date when I set the table of contents by which movies had come out.
Okay. I didn't even notice that.
Yeah. So I had to sort of at a certain point decide, okay. And part of it was deciding characters where I was sure I could isolate some ethical core that would be distinct from the other characters in the book, which isn't always easy. I mean, Green Arrow was, huge on the TV, but I was having a hard time figuring out exactly what was distinctive about Green Arrow that didn't just too closely overlap or align with other characters. Right. And the Flash was getting big on TV at the time as well. And I've since, made an argument about what the Flash means about mortality, because speed is distance over time, and it's the denominator that matters the most. And so really it's a character that has to deal with our struggle with time, and our struggle with time has to do with our mortality. And so there were other characters I would have and could have gone into. I mean, if I had written the book that was just for, the audience of I read comic books, it would have been full of obscurities and the kinds of characters that only we know and everybody else still. I mean, it's still the case that a lot of these characters that are popular now weren't known to the general population even 20 years ago or 15 years ago. But sure. I mean, is there any particular characters that you have in mind that I should have covered, or that you would have liked to have seen chapters on that I should consider?
Well, the thing, I mean, if we're talking about a sequel here, I got plenty of ideas. But no, I mean, I was curious because I mean, like, there were I think we've got the Hulk and the Wolverine and a lot of the big staples in films and stuff. Though who really talks about the Green Lantern movie? But that being said, it was interesting. I mean, it could have been interesting to see.
The best thing about the Green Lantern for movie for me is it gave me an excuse to write a chapter on Green Lantern.
Yeah. I mean, I'm waiting for that Far Sector adaptation. That's probably, maybe in the works somewhere at Warner Brothers. But even then, it would have been interesting to see like a comparison of, you talked about Green Arrow. It would have been interesting to see like the Green Arrow television style character compared to someone like the Punisher, because I feel like for some reason the CW has treated that character like that. But very recently we just read like an 80s era Green Arrow comic for an episode that we did about like read a book about something that came out the month you were born, and as someone born in the 80s, it was a perfect little book that came out in an era where it felt like they were trying to make Green Arrow this kind of cool espionage guy in the 80s with bright t-shirts, and everyone's got thick mustaches and big glasses and stuff, and for some reason everything takes place in Miami. I don't know why, but maybe that's just me conflating the game Grand Theft Auto Vice City for some reason in my head. But that being said, it could have been interesting, to see like a comparison there. I mean, I was thinking maybe Wonder Woman could have a spot there, and I think this is how you could push in to say, oh, let's talk about Miss Marvel. But I don't know if those two characters could come up side by side. But yeah, I mean, like, of course, there's plenty of staples you could have hit on that. I understand there's only so many pages you can write in a book. Sorry.
No, yeah. The pairing I would have done with Wonder Woman would have been with Black Panther.
Okay.
Comparing the way in which they are both royalty from utopias, who had to prove that they deserved their station and their powers, and then had to put their and not only proved it once in some sort of test, but live an ongoing test to demonstrate their worthiness of their great station and powers by continuing to use them for the benefit of the less advantaged. And
gotcha.
And so the nature of the chapters in my book is to always find two characters that have something essentially similar to make the comparison make sense, why I'm comparing those two, but also try to figure out what is the distinctive difference between them. And I still haven't settled on what the distinctive difference is between them. I've got that commonality, but I haven't made a decision yet regarding the distinctive difference. I mean, these kinds of qualities are, a lot, again, a lot of the qualities of superheroes, are found in, many dozens of superheroes. You could say share some quality in common. But the trick in my book was to try to figure out what was the thing that was the most distinctive core concept or problem or dilemma or quality that they represent or address, and try to find some character that I could contrast them against that was similar but not the same.
So if I can pitch a character, then
I'm sorry. I guess the main difference in part is that Black Panther still principally remains devoted to Wakanda,
right?
And Wonder Woman principally remains committed to representing Themyscira in man's world.
Yeah,
right.
And so where their priority is their priority their own or others, is, I think, probably the essential difference between, not that Black Panther doesn't care about the rest of the world, because obviously he goes and saves the world. But I think his principal priority is Wakanda, where a lot of Wonder Woman stories have to do about the fact that, she has left Paradise Island behind, right? And not allowed to go back for a lot of the classic stories, right? And has to represent it abroad indefinitely. And I guess another difference is I don't want to go in. They've made the Amazons more vulnerable over the years. I think for a long time the DC Amazons seemed absolutely untouchable, and that changed in probably in the 90s especially. Whereas the Wakandans are always at danger of being discovered and plundered.
Right. Yeah. Huh.
But go ahead.
I'm not necessarily trying to say we needed more chapters of this book, because I would love more chapters of this book. Because I like some of the things I really liked. I know, Paul, you had another question, but I like the comparison between characters across DC and Marvel, but also within Marvel. Like the Captain America, Mr. Fantastic chapter was probably my favorite to read because of the idea of ideals. Was fantastic. For lack of a better word, just to see the comparison, because in my mind, I'm like, oh no, these guys are kind of the same. But the argument that you made between the two of them was incredible. So I was just curious to know if there were more things that you wanted to talk about in this book, and maybe just said, okay, I want to keep it to these 5 chapters, or if there was maybe more you wanted to go off of.
But
I would read more about Black Panther and Wonder Woman and stuff if you've got more ideas.
A lot of the characters I drop names throughout to sort of nod to those of us who know more, that if I wasn't keeping myself to the most well-known, most recently featured in blockbuster films. I acknowledge, I included a discussion of Superman, but I think Supergirl is a more interesting character from an ethical perspective. I talk a chapter about Mr. Fantastic, because using him to represent the philosophical or the contemplative life, to compare him against Captain America as the representative of the active life or the citizen. I do mention that maybe, as much I work really hard to make Mr. Fantastic seem as good as I can. I try. He's an unlikable fellow, right? And I tried to show. One of the things that when I realized that his very superpowers represent the philosophical life. So the powers, it's not just he's a scientist and is always thinking really hard about the truth of the multiverse, but his powers, right? The liquidity of his body is a metaphor for the philosophical mind, that has to be able to take new shapes and go in places that otherwise it might not have been able to penetrate, and so forth. I was really happy to see that. This by happy accident. I don't know if Lee and Kirby thought that when they created the character, but it works out really well that he's got this malleable body to represent the life of the person who must have the most malleable of minds to be the thinker that they are. but I do make a little mention about the fact that I think, Sue Storm, or Invisible Woman, is a better hero than Mr. Fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she has like the evilest of all the powers, invisibility. Going back to Plato's Republic, invisibility is, the power that bad guys want and will turn good guys into bad guys.
Mm-hmm.
And so the fact that, she is as extraordinary as a hero as she is, she's probably the one who's probably the most heroic of all of them, in a certain sense, sure. Just in her personality. But just her power and her use of her powers mark her out to me as more impressive than a lot of other superheroes. So sure, I could have addressed a number of other characters that I didn't. And what has been preoccupying my mind lately as well is the book ends with some reflections on supervillains and what makes somebody villainous. Yeah. And I've had a number of people ask me, why don't you write supervillain ethics next and compare.
Oh no!
Yeah. I mean, I teach in a political science department, right? So every, one of the kinds of, research areas that colleagues of mine might, investigate and publish on is what they call global governance. I'm, of course, as a comic book reader, the phrase global governance always sounds to me like something that only supervillains want.
Right.
And so if our department posts an ad saying that we want to interview people for a position in global governance, I only want to interview the Red Skull and Dr. Doom and
Thor. Well, that's interesting because I believe at one point in the introduction to the book, you're going through your criteria you're using to pick characters, and I believe you make a mention to Booster Gold would be a character that if you had your druthers, you would write about. And like that's a character where if you want to talk about redemption, it's someone who's selfishly motivated that ends up becoming a hero. That's a really rich text, and that's a character that I don't think a lot of people know. So I like the idea of the complexity of even minor characters, to explore that you might not think there's a lot there, but when you start digging, there's a ton there.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I guess to follow up on that point, one of the benefits of picking well-known characters is that you have a lot of different interpretations. Is that how did you, choose which version of Superman you found the most interesting, or do you try to balance that out, the Silver Age version versus the Christopher Reeve version versus the Zack Snyder interpretation? Is there an attempt to balance those different interpretations of the character to make it seem more whole, or do you kind of acknowledge that they are open to interpretation that way?
Yeah, that is one of the big challenges. I mean, right, if I had decided to focus on Squirrel Girl, I would have to, ask, is the original depiction of her in what was a Marvel Superheroes, the quarterlies, right?
Mm-hmm.
The silly little throwaway piece, is that the same as Ryan North's character? And is Ryan North's character the same one that is in the young adult novels? We found out, yes, Ryan North put footnotes to the young adult novels in the comics to let you know that they're in continuity. Right. With the ones that have been around for decades and decades in so many different media. And there is this question of, are they compatible, right? Do they represent the same thing? So there was, I admit, for the sake of coming up with the kinds of arguments I needed to make for the sake of the book, where I was trying to isolate, as I say, some ethical core to each character, some simplification had to be done. Right. But I still wanted to, if you read my Batman chapter, there's nods to many different iterations of Batman, including the 60s TV. I made sure to try to, not just do Frank Miller. And Batman was actually not a character I loved growing up. I was always sort of bat averse. And so doing my research for the book required me to go and read a bunch of Batman stuff, especially stuff from the 70s that I now love, that I had never read before. And my son and I watched every episode of the animated series together, which I had watched off and on while it was on when I was in college, but never sort of, in a sort of completist fashion, and discovered just how that might be the best version of Batman out there, as far as I'm concerned, at least the most complete one. But the trick was, one thing I sort of kept in mind was we comic book fans know when there's a version of a character that betrays the character. Right. We know when something is just, we remember the arguments over the One Day Later Spider-Man and the deal with Mephisto and the question of whether or not that was consistent with Peter Parker. And then think about all the movies pre-Blade, pre-X-Men, and even in the early 2000s where we were like, that's not really Catwoman. Or that's not really
right.
So the fact that we can kind of come to a general consensus regarding that, although, comic book fans, our essence is that we argue and disagree with each other, and telling each other that we're wrong is kind of our pastime. We know that that's the case, that we can say certain versions of characters are true or not true to the character, even with a wide degree of variation. In fact, Into the Spider-Verse, Spider-Man movie and all of the Spider-Verse comic books introduce us to so many variations on Peter Parker. The fact that when we get sort of a dark version or an inverted character version or some what if from the dark multiverse or whatever, in order for it to be a compelling inverted dark version of a character, it has to be a play on the thing that we know is the essence of them. Right? Mm-hmm. So, the most recent, we got this, Dr. Manhattan Batman mashup and the one shot recently. I don't know if you saw that, and as fanfic as that seems, it's still, in order to, to have any sort of appeal to it, it has to sort of be, what if, what if you actually mash these up? It still has to be the motivations of Bruce Wayne, given the powers of Dr. Manhattan, right? Mm-hmm. And so I took refuge in the sense that there is a core to the characters, even if it meant that I was constantly going to have to make some choices regarding which things to feature in order to tell a coherent story. And again, I throw that out there to the readers as kind of the things that we as comic book readers and fans do when we challenge each other to say, have I got this right? Tell me your version is better than mine.
Right.
Prove me wrong.
I'm excited for all the people to read this book and then write furious Medium posts about why they believe that you were right or wrong. So all you IRCB listeners out there, get to writing. We want to hear what you have to say.
I'm sure they'll tell me all the ways I'm wrong. That's what we do. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Even if they are wrong themselves.
We comic book readers have tougher, thicker skin than we might be given credit for by non-fans. They don't realize just how many years to decades of weathering insult and offense and attack on our most sort of deepest felt convictions and partialities that we endure on a regular basis, even among those of us who ought to be our natural friends.
Yeah. It's funny you say that, because I don't know if I completely disagree that as someone who spent a lot of time on Reddit and as a moderator, but you know what, I appreciate the optimistic viewpoint, because I think that's ultimately true. Because when you go to a convention, I don't think people are necessarily getting in fist fights over which interpretation of Spider-Man is the best one. I think we all kind of understand that in a way, we all love Spider-Man. As an example, if a bunch of Spider-Man fans get together, they're all there for Spider-Man, even if they have their own favorite interpretation, if it's Tobey Maguire or if it's Brand New Day Spider-Man or if it's Ultimate Spider-Man. We're all here for Spider-Man, right?
Yeah.
I hear what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that speaks to, again, the strength of these characters and why this type of interpretation works. They are reflections, in a way, of values and ideas that society thinks are important and have changed over time. So I think they are really rich for philosophical interpretation in that way. So obviously the book, I think, is aimed at people that are familiar with superheroes, but how would you maybe pitch it to people that haven't read a lot of ethical philosophy or do you read a lot of academic writing? Do you think it's approachable to those types of people as well?
I tried really hard to make it readable to non-academic types. Mm-hmm. I teach, and part of it's because I teach classical ethics. I teach early modern political thought. I teach these kinds of things, in the classroom. That's my day job, as I said. And I'm constantly in need of examples to use to illustrate the material I'm teaching. And when I'm reading old books that, make old arguments that a lot of people in the classroom today might be inclined to regard as obsolete, no longer relevant. Why do I have to read this? speak to me today at all kinds of attitudes. I'm constantly in need of trying to render the ideas and the arguments more familiar to a contemporary audience. And my audience tends to be, 18 to 23-year-olds. Right. And so making sure I stay on top of popular culture in order to come up with examples on a regular basis for the sake of illustrating not only the meaning, but the relevance of the ideas and the arguments that I'm dealing with in the classroom. Means that I have to, and as a lifelong comic book nerd, I'm so grateful that the Marvel and the DC universes and various television series have made these characters that it used to be the case that only those of us who went to comic book stores knew anything about. Now everybody knows who they are.
Yeah,
right.
Everybody wants to be like them in various ways, or one or the other. That I can now make references to Tony Stark and everybody knows who I'm talking about, where even just 20 years ago, people would have looked, two people in the room would have got it and nudged each other and the rest of them would have not know. And so I have to stay on top of popular music. I try to stay on top of sports and a number of things so that I can come up with examples that, that appeal to different students in the room. And make sure I don't make too many references to Star Wars or something like that, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Most of them tend to be indirect now to see if anybody recognizes the obscure line of dialogue rather than anything else.
Yeah.
Look for the person whose eyes light up because they know what the reference was.
Right.
But they do the same thing with, my wife is a musician. And so the occasional reference to classic musical theater will always get somebody in the back of the room to go, wait a second, is that musical? And so that experience of 15 something years in the classroom helped me figure out how to try to write a book that could speak to people who are just being introduced to the history of political philosophy.
Right.
I've never been introduced to the history of political philosophy, and it's my job to communicate the idea. So I try to make it definitely the case that nobody had to have read their Tocqueville in order to understand my book. But if you've read your Tocqueville, there are parts of the book that you'll understand more readily, right? Yeah. You don't want anyone to have read any particular philosopher. But if you have, you'll see more of what I'm getting at. And at the same time, I wanted to write a book for people who are into philosophy, but maybe are just being introduced to superheroes through the TV shows, the movies. But they're interested in ideas and they're interested in political arguments and showing how these characters aren't just popcorn juvenile amusements, but speak to fundamental questions regarding right and wrong and good and bad, and what kind of life should you try to lead, and what kinds of extraordinary people in society should you admire, and what role models should you try to emulate or give to your children for them to imitate. That comic book heroes have the durability that they have because they speak so well and to these fundamental questions. They provide us with great raw material from which to ascend to reflections on the nature of the right and the good, which is the business of political philosophy. And so that was sort of the attitude I took, and the experience I have in the classroom gave me some reason to have some confidence that it could be done. And I'm really glad to find, Mike and Paul, that you found that I met some success in the product.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say that's a lot of boxes to check there, a lot of audiences you're trying to reach. And I think very successful in that regard. So, that final point you were making about the importance of superheroes, the importance of pop culture, Martha Nussbaum, the ethical philosopher, said that literature is the way that people learn to be ethical. And I think the broad range of what we consider literature, for me, would include comic books and superhero movies. So you're sort of taking up that call, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was a math science kid growing up.
Okay, yeah.
And before I made the extremely lucrative decision to study political philosophy.
Right.
when our society is such that when you have math science aptitudes, the educational system seizes upon that, right, and focuses you on that and pushes you in that, and again, not for bad reasons, right?
Right.
But an education that's too exclusively focused on the technological aspects of life and society is an incomplete one. And starting in high school, I sort of came to the realization that, literature, poetry, et cetera, were holes in my being that hadn't been filled. And I had to take personal responsibility to start, putting some substance in there, because otherwise it would be a deficiency or something lacking in me. And so I would, I started showing up to calculus class with, Homer's Iliad, or showing up to chemistry class with some Dostoevsky under my desk. Yeah. And not to say I grasped it all on the first try.
No, right.
But I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that literature humanizes. I mean, it's the essence of the humanities, and so, if people have only read their comic books and have never read their Tolstoy, I will be the preachy professor who say, you know what, find the Classics Illustrated version of Tolstoy, get a taste of it, and see whether or not you should go grab a 1,300-page copy of War and Peace someday and try to work your way through it. I will promise you it's worthwhile. But even in the absence of doing that, if comic books are where we can start and what we love, then I'm Socratic about this. You can start with ordinary, everyday opinions about things that people just happen to prefer and enjoy, and from there embark upon a sort of philosophical activity. And that spirit, and the philosophy says, classical philosophy says, it begins with a spirit of wonder, and there's a heck of a lot of wonder in superhero stories for us to start with as raw material.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I don't think I could even top asking a question like that. So I think this is where we're going to wrap up. But thank you for that fantastic, that peace of mind. I want to use that to everybody, say there's a lot of wonder in comics. I want you to start reading them. So Travis, thank you so much for joining us this week. This has been an incredible discussion. Everyone out there should go read Superhero Ethics, 10 Comic Book Heroes, 10 Ways to Save the World. Which one do we need most now? You can get it pretty much anywhere on the internet where books are sold, if I'm not mistaken. But go ahead and check that out. And Travis, where can people find you on the internet if they want to ask you more, philosophical questions about their favorite superheroes?
Where would they find me on the internet? I don't social media.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know what to tell people. If they want to argue with me directly, they can reach out to me at work, as it were. This is
okay.
So, sure. But I'm not a tweeter, so I don't have any place to tell your listeners to go and follow me and troll me. So.
Okay, well, if everybody checks out the book, that's at least the start, and then you guys can send your angry emails over to me, and I'll decide whether or not I pass them along. But anyways, again, thank you so much for joining us on the show, Travis. This has been an incredible discussion.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you, Paul, too.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
You can follow me and Paul on Twitter. You can follow us at OhiPauly for Paul, at Mike Rapin for me, and you can follow the show at IRCB Podcast, where I try to share as much stuff as I possibly can, and on Instagram, where we give away free stickers if you send me a DM.
There you go. This show, as well as many of our subscriber-only episodes, are powered by fans like you on Patreon. If you want to sign up to become a Patreon, go over to patreon.com/IRCB podcast. And if you haven't already, please take a moment to rate and review the show. I think 5 stars is a pretty fair rating. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Make sure you jump on our Discord at ircbpodcast.com/Discord to join us on our semi-weekly book club, talk about Animal Crossing, talk about anything that you really want. It's a really fun time, and we do some hangouts there every once in a while. And make sure to tell a friend or two about the show. Infinity Shred does all of the music for IRCB. We can't thank them enough. They are the best band in the universe. Zander is a good friend, a great high-fiver, and just a person who edits the show. He's fantastic. I want to say thank you to Paul, and extra special thanks to Travis again for being on the show. And until next time, comics are good, and so are you.